It began with a lingering note, a sound that did not belong in the cold hush of morning. As Lady Fenlay's fingers slid from the keys of the drawing-room pianoforte, a faint rustle followed, not from the fabric of her widow's silk, but from within the instrument itself, as if some forgotten hand had stirred beneath the ivory lid. She paused. No one else heard it. The family was assembled like marble statuary about the room, silent, cold, composed, and entirely uninterested in the music or in her. In the corner, near the broad archway leading to the garden, stood Ada Bell, small, dark-haired, 22, and forever mistaken for 17. A servant girl, but not quite. She had been raised in a household like a useful ornament. A bastard cousin whispered about and pitted only when convenient. She poured the tea with the grace of a duchess and received orders with the obedience of a scullery maid. The great Fenlay estate mourned the death of Lord Oswin, patriarch and peer, the one who held everything, the lands, the titles, the fortune. His passing had summoned a tide of black-draped relatives, each offering for solemnity, while casting silent calculations across the room. The question hummed beneath the black lace and polished boots. Who would inherit now? Everyone believed they knew the answer. It would be young Benedict, the second son, newly returned from Oxford and newly invested with his father's ambitions. The elder son, Lionel, had long been dismissed for his scandalous temperament and unwholesome attachments. And Ada? Ada was nothing, an error of the past, half-blooded and wholly invisible. Outside, the wind clawed the hedges. Inside, Ada moved from guest to guest with the quiet glide of someone born into houses that were never hers. She passed close to Lady Fenlay, who had not played the piano since her husband's death. But today, she had sat down with suddenness that startled the room and struck a brief, broken chord, something unresolved. That sound, or what followed it, would be the first fracture. Behind Ada, the dowager's maid whispered that she thought she heard a rat beneath the floorboards. A snort of laughter followed from one of the younger cousins. Ada said nothing, but her gaze flickered to the pianoforte. At the far end of the room, Mr. Millstone, the family solicitor, stood with a portfolio clutched too tightly in his thin hands. His eyes scanned the room not for grief, but for advantage, or perhaps for guilt. Ada had seen him speaking to Lady Fenlay in hushed tones 2 nights prior, after the candles had burned low and the corridor echoed too much. The widow's face had been drawn, but she nodded. No one noticed Ada's stillness then. They rarely did. As the family prepared for the formal reading of the will, the air thickened. Chairs scraped. A glass was set too hard on the sideboard. Somewhere in the garden, a bird cried, and as the pianoforte stood untouched, quiet once more, Ada lingered just a moment longer by its edge, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. There was something hidden there, something that did not belong, and though she did not yet know what it was, she sensed, like a breath before a scream, that whatever it was, it would change everything. The bastard had no claim. Everyone agreed. But the bastard was about to find something they had all ignored. The will reading was set for noon, but the house had stirred since dawn. Servants polished already gleaming stair rails and carried trays, as if their movements could muffle the tension growing among the Fenlays. Mourning clothes rustled in corridors that had known more joy in rumor than in reality. Ada moved among them like a shadow, her step soundless, her presence overlooked. In the breakfast room, Lady Fenlay took her tea without sugar, staring past the window at the overgrown garden her husband had promised to tame and never did. Beside her, young Benedict, 18 and arrogantly handsome, complained in hushed tones about the delay in executing the will. "It's all formality," he said, fiddling with the silver spoon. "Everyone knows I'm to inherit." Father was quite clear. Lionel stood at the window, untouched coffee in hand, his profile sharp, his waistcoat slightly rumpled. He didn't speak. He rarely did these days, not since the family had made it evident that his affections were a matter of both embarrassment and danger. His glance toward Benedict was neither affectionate nor fraternal. Ada was summoned to serve. She moved between the brothers with the neutrality of a chess piece, her eyes lowered. As she poured, Benedict glanced at her with casual condescension. "Careful," he muttered, not even looking directly at her. "That's French porcelain." Father would rise from his grave if you cracked it. She offered no reply. Lady Fenley did not correct her son. She never did. Instead, she murmured something about Mr. Millstone's punctuality and the importance of appearances. The family must look united, no matter what comes, she said to the room, more to herself than to anyone else. Ada caught the edge in her voice, too strained for true confidence. At 11:30, the family gathered in the grand salon where portraits of long-dead Fenleys glared down from gilt frames. Chairs were arranged with military precision. Ada stood at the side of the room, not among the footmen or maids, but not seated either. She occupied that strange in-between space the family had always assigned her, present yet dispensable. Cousins arrived in murmuring clumps, dressed in somber silks, and eyeing each other with veiled expectation. The Dowager Countess dozed in her chair, a lace handkerchief clutched like a surrender flag. Lionel leaned against the marble hearth, jaw clenched. Benedict lounged in the seat nearest the solicitor's desk, as though the throne were already his. Then Mr. Millstone entered, precise as a pendulum, and all sound vanished. "Shall we begin?" he asked with a little bow. The crackle of paper sounded loud in the silence. He began with the preamble. Legal language that hung dryly in the air. Names were read, token bequests acknowledged, servants received sovereigns. A painting was given to a cousin, a carriage promised the dowager. Then, to my eldest son, Lionel Oswin Fenley. A breath caught. Lionel looked up. I leave the west wing of Fenley Manor, and a stipend of £1,000 per annum. There it was, insult disguised as inheritance. To my younger son, Benedict Charles Fenley. Mr. Millstone paused, blinked, then continued. I leave the entirety of the Fenley estate, its lands, properties, holdings, and title, with full right to barony and entail future claims, as per the enclosed instructions. Benedict's smile was immediate. It bordered on smug. Lady Fenley allowed herself a breath of relief. Lionel's knuckles whitened around the edge of the mantelpiece. And Ada, standing behind them all, watched the room, not the reader, watched how they moved, shifted, sighed, watched how no one noticed her watching. When Mr. Millstone closed the will and folded it with reverence, there were polite coughs, murmured condolences. The ceremony of power had concluded, but still something was wrong. Something did not settle. As the others filed out, returning to their wine, their whispered judgments, and their awaiting carriages, Ada drifted back into the drawing room. The pianoforte stood where it had for decades, lid slightly ajar. The same strange rustle echoed in her memory, a sound too faint, too deliberate to be nothing. She glanced once behind her. No one called her name. No one ever did. And so, alone in a hush of old wood and older secrets, she lifted the lid. Her fingers brushed against felt, against strings, and then something folded, something sealed, something hidden where no air had thought to look. It was the size of a gentleman's handkerchief, folded once, then again, and sealed with a crest Ada knew better than her own name. The Fenley Lion, embossed in gold wax, half-worn but unmistakable. The envelope was old, creased at the corners, edges softened by time, but untouched by dust. As if it had been placed there not long ago, and with great care, Ada stood with it in her hand, heart trembling not from fear, but recognition. She had seen her mother write such letters once, long ago, thick cream paper, heavy ink, that same lion head seal. But back then, the letters were burned as soon as they arrived. Lady Fenley had made certain of that. The past was not to be recorded. But Ada remembered. She was 8 when her mother died. Margaret Bell, a lady's companion once, until she became a scandal. She had served Lady Fenley when the latter was still a new wife, the manor still in renovation, and Lord Oswin still young enough to defy his mother's will. Margaret had been everything the family despised. Poor, clever, beautiful in an uncontained way, and loved, deeply, privately loved. Ada remembered creeping from the nursery one summer evening and seeing them, her mother and Lord Oswin, speaking in the garden shadows, not touching, not kissing, just standing too close, with a kind of silence between them that made the air tremble. That moment had stayed in her bones. It was the moment she understood she would never belong to either world, not the servants nor the families. After Margaret died of fever, Ada had remained at Fenley Manor by Lady Fenlay's reluctant consent. "The girl is of no threat," she had said, her voice like frost. "Let her be raised among the linens. She'll marry a gardener, if she's fortunate." But Ada had learned to listen instead. She listened when servants whispered near the scullery. She listened when Lady Fenlay dismissed guests with brittle laughter and biting words. She listened at keyholes, behind curtains, through half-closed doors. And she never forgot what her mother told her in secret once, before she died. "Your father is a man of duty, not of courage. But one day, Ada, that duty will leave him a trail of regret too heavy to carry. You will not be rich. You will not be safe. But you will know the truth." Now, the truth trembled in her hand. Ada slipped the envelope into the hidden pocket of her mourning apron just as footsteps echoed in the corridor. She closed the piano lid gently, leaving no sign of intrusion. Lady Fenlay's voice approached, sharp, irritated. "Why she insists on hovering, I cannot understand," she was saying to someone. "She has no place in these matters. She never has." Ada turned and exited to the side door before they entered, her head lowered, but her fingers curled tight around her skirts, as if pressing the envelope deeper against her skin. In the servants' corridor, she paused, pressing her back to the wall. The candlelight flickered over her pale face. She wanted to open it desperately, but not here, not yet. It had to be done when no one could see, when the house slept, when the lies lay dormant. For now, she breathed in and out and remembered the scent of her mother's perfume, violets and paper, and how, even dying, she had smiled. "You will know the truth." Ada stepped into the corridor's shadow and vanished once more. The envelope burned like a live thing in her pocket. And upstairs in the salon, Lionel stared into the hearth where no fire burned, his jaw clenched, while Benedict, ever the victor, raised a toast with cousins already eyeing his new fortune. None of them knew what had just moved beneath their feet, but they would. The night draped itself over Fenley Manor like velvet, thick and muffling. Candles sputtered in the sconces of the upper corridors, their wax forming pale rivers against the brass. The house had settled into the unnatural hush that follows death and inheritance. Too quiet, as though even the ghosts waited to see what would happen next. In the east servants' wing, Ada lit a single taper and shut her chamber door with care. Her room was narrow, tucked beneath the eaves, barely more than a shelf for sleeping and storage. But she had made it hers over the years. A pressed flower book beneath the cot, a sewing tin with needles sharper than knives, and a wooden box with a loose board under which she kept things not meant to be seen. She pulled the envelope from her apron, fingers trembling slightly, not with fear, but with something more electric, dread tangled with hope. She held it beneath the candlelight, examining the seal once more. The lion's head was real, not a forgery. She knew it too well. And below it, faint in her father's sharp hand, a single name, Adeline. Her full name, the one never spoken. She broke the seal. The letter was written on thick vellum. The ink faded only slightly. She recognized Lord Oswin's handwriting, precise, disciplined, but streaked here with something more human, more hurried. To whom it may concern, if this letter is found, it is to be considered a legal testament of truth and identity, to be presented to Mr. William Millstone or a magistrate of neutral standing. It concerns the legitimacy of my daughter, Adeline Margaret Bell, born of Margaret Bell in the year of our Lord 1803. She is my child by blood and intention, though the circumstances of her birth require discretion unbecoming of a nobleman and father. I hereby acknowledge Adeline as my lawful heir in spirit, if not in name, and entrust this document to be preserved in secrecy until such time as it may shield her from harm or restore what should have always been hers. Signed, Oswin Fenlay, Lord of Fenley Manor, March 10th, 1824. Ada stared at the words for what felt like an age. No claim. That had been their verdict. No legitimacy, no inheritance, not even a name. But this was not just a confession. It was a legal crack in the walls they'd built around her. He had written it to someone. If found to be presented, why hide it in the piano of all places? Had he wanted it discovered? Or had someone else placed it there, afraid of what it might bring? She folded it carefully and slipped it into the hidden board beneath her cot. Then she sat, unmoving, candle burning low, as the memory of her mother's voice echoed faintly within her. One day, Ada, one day, it will matter that you existed. That day had come. At dawn, before the household stirred, Ada rose and dressed with quiet purpose. She took a shawl, her gloves, and a pair of walking shoes wrapped in old linen. Then, when the first bell rang for the scullery maids, she stepped out, not to the kitchens, but toward the stables. Gareth, the youngest stable hand, spotted her. He had always liked Ada. They shared no words, but she had once mended his coat with thread she bought herself, and he remembered kindness. She handed him a sealed note. "You said your uncle rides to West Thistledown today?" He nodded. "This must reach Mr. William Millstone's office before nightfall," she said. "It's a legal urgency." He hesitated, then tucked it inside his coat. "Will he understand?" "He will if he sees the seal," Ada said, her eyes locked with his. "Do not let anyone intercept it." Gareth mounted and rode before anyone could question him, and Ada returned to the manor before the second bell. By midday, the house had woken fully. The corridors filled with rustling skirts and murmured plans. The new lord, Benedict, was preparing to meet with the steward. Lionel had left the house early, alone and unannounced. Lady Fenley was cloistered in her rooms, penning letters with a fury that left no time for grief. No one noticed Ada slip back into her duties. No one noticed that a single envelope had left the estate. And no one noticed that the girl they dismissed had begun to move through the manor not as a servant, but as a storm waiting to break. The day the letter returned, the rain came with it. It began as a light mist, drifting over fields and settling into the hedgerows. But by afternoon it had grown into a steady downpour that battered the windows of Fenley Manor and turned the gravel path into a stream of mud. Servants rushed to cover the carriages. Fires were stoked in every room, but still the air felt damp, heavy, as though something in the walls themselves had begun to weep. Ada stood in the drawing room, ostensibly dusting the shelves, though no one had asked her to. She positioned herself with care, close enough to the window to see approaching riders, far enough from the door not to invite removal. She wore her plain black dress and apron, but she had pinned her mother's brooch beneath her collar, a small violet cameo, nearly invisible but defiantly hers. At precisely 4 o'clock, a knock came at the front door, sharp, unmistakable. Within seconds, the butler appeared, frowning. Visitors were not expected. The family had no guests scheduled, and the weather was too foul for social calls. Mr. Millstone stepped into the entrance hall, drenched in his overcoat, a leather satchel clutched tight beneath his arm. Water dripped from his brimmed hat as he removed it with care. "I must speak with the family," he said, voice clipped. Benedict, summoned from the study, arrived first. Lionel came moments later, his coat still on from his long walk in the storm. Lady Fenley descended slowly, each step deliberate, her lips pressed into a firm, pale line. They gathered once more in the salon, though the air was different now, more taut. Ada, silent and unmoving, remained just beyond the doorframe, unacknowledged as always. Millstone began without pleasantries. "This morning," he said, removing a letter from his case, "I received a document delivered by a trusted hand from this estate. It bears Lord Oswin Fenlay's seal and signature, and contains language that qualifies as a testamentary letter under provisions of the Wills Act of 1837. Lady Fenley stiffened. Benedict blinked. Lionel folded his arms. Millstone unfolded the paper slowly. In it, Lord Oswin names a previously unacknowledged heir. A daughter. There was silence. Then a faint scoff from Benedict. Impossible. There was no daughter. "Not of Lady Fenlay's body," Millstone replied, calm but firm, "but his daughter nonetheless. He names her explicitly, Adeline Margaret Bell." The room convulsed with sound, gasps, half-formed denials, the scrape of a chair leg across marble. "That girl," Benedict spat. "The maid?" "She is not merely a maid," Millstone said, glancing at the doorway. For the first time, seeing her, Ada stood perfectly still. 1,000 moments pressed behind her eyes. Every time she had been overlooked, every slight wrapped in false politeness. Her hands were clasped before her, but her chin was lifted. "She is the daughter of Margaret Bell," Millstone continued, "a companion to Lady Fenlay and, as evidenced in this letter, the chosen heir of Lord Oswin in spirit and blood. He expresses intention for this letter to stand as formal acknowledgment." Lady Fenlay rose. "That letter is a forgery." "No, madam," Millstone replied, voice sharp now. "The seal is original. The paper matched the manor's private stock, the inconsistent with Lord Oswin's correspondence from the year noted. I recognize the hand. I have authenticated dozens of his letters." Benedict's face had gone red. What claim could she possibly have? There is no legitimacy, no marriage, no title. And yet, Millstone interrupted, under the revised stipulations of Lord Oswin's previous will, which I now believe this letter was meant to amend in spirit if not in law, Miss Bell may be entitled to a significant portion of the personal estate, especially if it can be demonstrated that concealment occurred. Lady Fenlay turned her gaze upon Ada, cold as a blade. "You dare!" Ada said nothing, but Lionel looked at her differently now, eyes not warm but alert. He stepped forward, slowly, and turned to Millstone. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "There will be a reevaluation," Millstone said. "Potential litigation. And if the court deems this letter valid in intent, then Miss Bell's rights to inheritance, particularly in regard to any unentailed assets, will be legally recognized." The fire crackled, the only sound, and then from the doorway came the smallest voice. "I didn't ask for anything," Ada said, her words plain, quiet, unshaken. "I only wanted the truth, and now you all have it." Lady Fenlay moved as if to speak, but her voice caught. For the first time in 20 years, she had no script to follow, no curtain behind which to hide. And across the room, a single envelope, creased and water-stained from travel, lay open on the table like a wound. The room that once dismissed Ada now could not look away. The unraveling had begun. The days that followed twisted the household into knots. Were the letter, though carefully hushed, slipped like ink through water. It moved from servant to steward, cousin to confidant, until every corner of Fenlay Manor seemed to tremble with it. Ada's name, once a whisper barely spoken outside the laundry rooms, became a weight on every tongue. Lady Fenlay struck first. On the second morning after the letter's presentation, Ada was summoned, not to the drawing room, not to the library, but to the gallery, a long hall lined with ancestral portraits and overlooking the west lawn. It was a cold space, built for grandeur, not comfort, and Lady Fenlay used it well. She stood beneath the portrait of her late husband, tall and rigid in her mourning silks. Her eyes, once the color of ice, now seemed to have frozen over entirely. "You will return the letter," she said without preamble. Ada stood at the far end, her hands folded, back straight. "It is not yours to demand. It was never meant to see the light. Do you think I don't know what you're doing? This is not about truth. It is ambition wrapped in sentimentality." Ada did not flinch. "And what was your silence, then? Protection or cowardice?" Lady Fenlay's eyes narrowed. "You think a scullery-born bastard has the right to question me?" "No," Ada said softly. "I think a daughter does." A crack echoed in the air as Lady Fenlay's gloved hand struck Ada across the face. Not hard enough to bruise, but enough to echo. "I have spent 2 decades silencing the shame," she hissed. "I buried your mother's name. I gave you food, shelter, safety, when I should have had you removed. And this is how you repay it." Ada's cheek burned, but she did not move away. "You gave me a prison, not safety," she said, voice low and steady. "And now you are angry the door has opened." The dowager appeared the following afternoon, wrapped in shawls and disdain. "This is a farce," she declared to the room as Mr. Millstone reviewed his findings with the steward and 2 attending legal clerks. Oswin would never have named her. Not her. There must be a trick in it. The family rallied. Cousins who had not spoken to Ada in years suddenly found it necessary to warn of the danger of precedent. One uncle muttered that if bastards could lay claim to family estates, half of Derbyshire would be upturned. Lady Fenlay made inquiries to her London solicitor, demanding intervention, contestation, erasure, But the proof held. The seal was real. The ink was tested. Lord Oswin's signature was affirmed by 2 external experts. Millstone had moved swiftly, filing a formal notice with the regional court in Bexley, requesting the letter be examined under testamentary intent. Still, they tried to unravel her. One morning, Ada's room was found ransacked, nothing stolen, but drawers overturned, linens torn, her hidden keepsake box smashed. The letter had not been there, of course. Millstone had taken it into custody the day. He read it aloud. When Ada arrived in the breakfast room the next day, the conversation ceased immediately. Lionel alone acknowledged her presence, offering a seat with a quiet nod. She chose not to accept. Benedict laughed as she passed. Careful, he said to no one in particular. She might claim the table next. Ada said nothing, but she saw it all. The venom, the fear, the slow unraveling of their carefully knotted world. In the evenings, the kitchen staff whispered of her with new eyes, not as the bastard girl anymore, but as the girl with the letter, the one who had made Lady Fenley lose her temper, the one whose name was now being discussed in the same breath as Lord Oswin's. But not all turned away. Mr. Millstone remained steady, visiting twice more that week with updates. He did not flatter. He simply told her the truth. There will be opposition, he said, sitting with her in the steward's office one night. They will accuse you of forgery, of deception. They will claim you manipulated me. But so long as the court recognizes the letter's intention, they cannot make it disappear. I don't care for the fortune, Ada murmured. Then why fight? Because my mother was not nothing, and neither am I. Millstone regarded her a long moment. They built their names upon silence, he said, and now silence won't save them. That night, thunder cracked the sky, and beneath the manor's ancient roof, the family who thought her unworthy began to feel the first tremors of something they could not control. She had not raised her voice, had not thrown a punch, had not claimed the chair when it was offered, and yet they were breaking. It was during the second week of legal deliberations that the first real fracture within the family occurred. Not a legal one, but a deeply human unraveling. Lionel returned early from a ride to the rain-soaked moors, his boots muddy, his coat drenched, his expression unreadable. The servants had grown used to his silences, but that day he moved through the house with a kind of unsettled purpose, as though something within him had shifted. He did not speak to Ada directly, not at first. Instead, he stood for a long time in the library, staring at the rows of leather-bound books their father had once pretended to read. Then, with a breath like surrender, he turned and made his way to the morning room, where Ada sat repairing a torn hem for one of the kitchen maids. He did not knock. She looked up. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside. "I remember your mother," he said, his voice so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. Ada laid the fabric down. "Do you?" She used to sing when she thought no one was listening, in the garden beneath the old willow. Ada blinked. "That tree's gone." "It died the year she did," Lionel replied. No one noticed. "Except me?" They were silent for a long moment. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "Because they will never forgive you, Ada. Not for being born. Not for proving them wrong. And not for making our father something more than a myth." "Do you forgive me?" she asked. His gaze lifted to hers, dark and uncertain. "There's nothing to forgive. Only things to understand." He turned then and left, coat still dripping but lighter somehow. It was later that day, just before supper, that Lady Fenley collapsed. She had been walking to the West Wing, overseeing the removal of Lord Oswin's remaining effects. The portraits were being taken down, the drapes inspected, the books reviewed for donation. Her instructions were sharp, clinical, precise, until she reached the old study door, the one Lord Oswin had kept locked for most of their marriage. "There," she paused. Her hand trembled on the knob. One of the footmen approached, offering assistance. She waved him off. Then, without warning, she crumpled. The physician was summoned within the hour. "Fainting," he said, brought on by exhaustion, strain, and an overwrought constitution. But Ada knew better. That night, as the house hushed itself around the sick room, Ada stood outside the door, listening through the panel. "She's muttering," the physician whispered. "Something about a girl, a piano, Margaret." Ada stepped back, heart-hammering. In the days that followed, Lady Fenley recovered slowly, but her fury never quite returned. She no longer barked commands or summoned Ada for private reprimands. Instead, she sat by the fire in her rooms, clutching a faded handkerchief embroidered with initials no one recognized, MB. The servants said nothing, but their glances grew warmer when Ada passed. A tray left in her room, an extra fire laid in her grate. One evening, as the sun cast long amber shadows across the stairwell, the housekeeper, Mrs. Crawley, paused beside Ada at the linen table. "I knew your mother," she said without looking at her. "We all did. She was kind, smarter than most." Too good for the silence they gave her. Ada nodded once. "Thank you." And still, despite all this, Benedict raged. He prowled the estate like a wolf with a thorn in its paw, barking at footmen, sending the steward into fits of anxiety, cursing the legal delays. His birthright, as he saw it, was being strangled by parchment and ink. "She'll ruin us," he said one evening in the billiards room, brandy in hand, voice slurring with resentment. "She'll drag our name into the mud." "You mean," Lionel said, quiet but cutting, "she'll tell the truth, something this family has avoided since before you were born." Benedict turned to him, rage flashing. "You always did love lost causes." "No," Lionel said, eyes fixed on the cue ball. "I just learned what not to lose." The ball cracked, scattering the table, and from the top landing, unseen, Ada heard it all. What had begun as revelation had now become reckoning. Not just legal, not just financial, but emotional. A mother unraveling, a brother defending her, another breaking beneath the weight of his entitlement, and Ada, still silent, still standing. The letter had shaken the walls, but it was the truth, the unbearable human truth, that had begun to collapse the people within them. The morning of the inquiry dawned silver-gray, with mist clinging low across the Fenley estate, like an old grief refusing to lift. A hired carriage waited at the edge of the drive, the wheels slick with dew, the horse snorting as though sensing it had been summoned not merely for travel, but for transformation. Inside the manor, silence reigned. The family was to remain at home. The inquiry would take place at the magistrate's office in Bexley. Only Mr. Millstone, Ada, and 2 witnesses would attend. The letter had been authenticated. Its meaning now rested not in ink or seal, but in interpretation. Ada dressed with care, her movements deliberate. She wore a gown not borrowed but bought, modest, slate-gray wool, with a neat collar and a single pearl pin at her throat. Her hair, once braided low like a maid's, was now twisted into a simple chignon. There were no frills, no attempt to impress. She looked, for the first time, exactly like who she was, a woman standing between the world she was born into and the one that had always pretended she did not exist. As she descended the stairs, a voice stopped her. "You're not just going to let them decide who you are you?" Lionel stood at the base of the staircase, his hand resting on the newel post. He wore no cravat, his waistcoat loose, but his eyes were clear. "I'm going," she said, "because someone has to say it aloud." He stepped aside, allowing her pass. "Then say it for both of us." Outside, Mr. Millstone waited with documents neatly secured beneath his coat. He offered a brief nod, holding the carriage door. "They'll not know what to make of you," he murmured. "That's often the best place to begin." She stepped inside. The road to Bexley wound through autumn-stripped trees and past fields that had once fed the manor's pride. Now, they passed by like witnesses, bare and honest. The inquiry was brief in speech, but deep in consequence. The magistrate, a solemn man with eyes dulled by years of watching families fracture, took his time reading the letter. Millstone spoke with quiet precision, laying out the facts. The seal, the paper, the corroboration of Lord Oswyn's private correspondences. The pianist from Fenley, Lady Fenlay's own maid, testified that she'd witnessed the Lord sitting at the pianoforte, placing something inside 2 days before his sudden illness. And Ada spoke, softly, but without apology. My mother did not ask for recognition. She asked only that I be allowed to live without shame. I never expected a name or a fortune, but I am not invisible. And now, you cannot pretend I never was. When the inquiry concluded, the magistrate did not render a decision. That would come later, through channels stamped and sealed. But something unspoken had shifted. Millstone, as they walked back toward the carriage, offered his hand, not as a solicitor, but as an equal. Regardless of their ruling, he said, "You have done what most of them never dared." Back at the manor, the carriage returned to uneasy silence. But Ada did not stay. Instead, she crossed the threshold slowly, only to retrieve a single item, her mother's journal, hidden beneath the floorboard of her old chamber. She carried it with both hands, wrapped in muslin. In the entry hall, Lady Fenley waited, not dressed, not seated, simply standing, one hand on the banister. She looked older, more brittle, as though the portrait version of herself had begun to crack. Ada paused. "You took my childhood," she said, not in bitterness, but in fact. Lady Fenley met her gaze. "And you took my silence." "Then we are even." Lady Fenley opened her mouth, but nothing came. She stepped aside, and for the first time in her life, Ada Bell crossed the front threshold of Fenley Manor, not as a servant, nor as a guest, but as herself. Outside, the sun had broken through the mist at last. The carriage waited, and as she stepped inside it, as the door closed with finality and the wheels began to turn, the house behind her did not crumble, but it did not feel like home. She did not look back. She did not need to, because she had left something behind that none of them could erase. Her absence, as much as her presence, would haunt every room. It rained again the following morning, not with thunder, but with the soft, persistent grief of an estate learning how to breathe under altered light. The windows of Fenley Manor remained shuttered longer than usual, as though the house itself wished not to witness what was becoming of its inhabitants. The letter's ripple had not ended with Ada's departure. 3 days after her carriage vanished into the horizon, the magistrate's ruling arrived, sealed in wax and tied with black cord. Mr. Millstone delivered it himself to the manor's grand front door. The butler, uncertain whether to allow him in, hesitated. "I won't be long," Millstone said simply. The family assembled in the salon again, less crowded this time, the atmosphere dry and thin. The cousins had vanished back to their London flats and countryside villas. Only the core remained. Lady Fenley, drawn and silent in the corner chair, Benedict, arms crossed, jaw clenched, Lionel, standing as before, eyes not on the letter, but on the window. Millstone opened the ruling. "The magistrate has recognized the testamentary letter as legally valid," he announced. "As such, Miss Adeline Margaret Bell is entitled to claim a share of Lord Oswin's personal estate, unentailed assets including his private account, several stocks, the London townhouse, and the rights to certain family heirlooms not explicitly willed to another." Silence. Then Lady Fenley, voice frayed, asked, "How much?" Millstone replied without malice, "Enough to stand beside any of you at court, or never return to it, if she chooses." Benedict turned, furious. "She's nothing. She's not even legitimate." "No," Lionel said softly, "but she's here, in this house, in this family, in all our silences." Millstone handed the formal document to the steward and left without waiting for the inevitable fury. That evening, trunks were packed in the West Wing. Benedict would travel to Bath for recovery, though it was whispered in the halls that he had been urged away by the family solicitor for his own reputation's sake. His temper had grown erratic, sharp enough to cut through even Lady Fenley's patience. Meanwhile, Lionel moved quietly through the estate, taking meals in solitude, walking alone in the gardens. He did not attempt to take control of anything. He had no designs on the estate now. He wrote letters, many of them none addressed to Ada. And Lady Fenley? She did not speak of Ada again, but her actions betrayed her. The pianoforte was never played. The gallery, once her domain, was locked. Her portrait in mourning black was scheduled to be removed and reframed, but the request was never fulfilled. The servants, long the estate's true historians, made note of the changes in whispers. Ada's name is gone from the laundry list. The young master no longer dines in the red room. The lady hasn't spoken to the housekeeper in a week. Even the dowager, once so ferocious, asked for Ada by name. The girl with the envelope, she said to the nursemaid, not quite remembering her title. She had her father's mouth. Did you see it? The line of it, when she stood her ground. But Ada herself had vanished into the countryside. A letter arrived 2 weeks after the ruling, handwritten, addressed to Mr. Millstone. In it, Ada formally declined the London townhouse. She requested instead the smallest cottage on the outermost edge of the Fenley lands, near where her mother used to walk alone in spring, wild violets sprouting along the stone path. No message was sent to Lady Fenley, no invitation to reconcile. The family did not know where she went, beyond that she had chosen quiet over spectacle. But the house changed in her absence. The drawing-room mirror, once spotless, remained smudged at the corners. The gallery light burned out and was not replaced. Footmen hesitated when entering rooms. And the youngest maid, not 10 years old, took to placing a violet beneath the pianoforte lid each Sunday morning, never explaining why. No one dared speak her name anymore. But every corridor remembered her. Every note of the pianoforte, untouched, echoed her silence. And still the estate stood. But something essential had gone. The winter came late that year, as if even the seasons hesitated to settle over what remained of Fenley Manor. The hedgerows browned slowly, the wind paused at the gates, and the first frost arrived not with sharp snap, but a gradual hush, like breath holding itself across the fields. In a modest stone cottage nestled beyond the western edge of the estate, where the land dipped and curved around a cluster of elder trees, Ada now lived. The roof was thatched, the hearth never cold, and the walls were lined with her mother's books, dog-eared volumes of poetry, household accounts, and a slim leather journal she had never dared open before the letter. She did not return to the manor, not even when a second letter arrived from Millstone, informing her that Benedict had forfeited his rights to several investments out of spite. They were hers now. She read the letter once, placed it in a drawer, and returned to her sewing. Sometimes she walked to the edge of the woods where the willow once stood, now only a stump softened by moss and years. There, she laid wild violets in spring, lavender in summer, and fir in winter. She did not speak. There were no words left of the past, only silence and the feeling of presence that memory brought. Letters came occasionally, one from Lionel, cautious and without sentiment. He did not apologize. He simply wrote, "You were always in the house. We just never looked. That is not your fault." She did not reply. Another arrived weeks later, and signed but unmistakable. Lady Fenlay's hand, precise, elegant, and trembling. "I will not ask forgiveness, but I no longer play the piano. That must mean something, even if only to me." Ada placed that one beside her mother's journal. She did not read it again. The townspeople in Bexley spoke of her in low tones, respectful but uncertain. Some said she had turned down a house in Mayfair. Others said she was hiding her wealth out of pride. But those closest, the grocer, the schoolteacher, the postmaster, knew her by name. Miss Bell, they called her with a polite nod, and she nodded back without correction. She taught local children to read, repaired garments for women who had no coin, and never asked for praise. But the memory of what she had done, of how she had stood silent while their world cracked, hung over the region like a bell that had been rung too loud to unhear. At the manor, the seasons continued to pass. Lionel took over affairs, but never moved into his father's study. The gallery remained locked, and each year, on the anniversary of Lord Oswin's death, the estate chapel held a service no one truly mourned. Lady Fenley stopped attending after the 3rd year. The staff, many of whom remained, still cleaned the drawing-room weekly, but the pianoforte was left untouched, and every so often, beneath its closed lid, they found a violet, always fresh, always silent. No one asked who placed them there, and no one dare remove them. One spring, many years later, a girl born to the new housekeeper wandered into the library and asked why there were no portraits of Lady Margaret Bell. The butler, now white-haired and slower with his steps, replied simply, "Some things were never hung on walls, child, but they still remain." The girl nodded, though she did not understand. And across the manor, in quiet corners and curtained alcoves, the presence of Ada, Adeline Margaret Bell, lingered not in grand gestures, but in the things left behind. The letter, the silences, the names no longer spoken in jest. And still, no one dare mention her name again. But every room remembered her,